Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 27 of the Future of Work show, where we discuss ideas that have relevance to all our futures. So, for the last 6 or 7 months, we've been discussing ideas with the worldwide academics and practitioners to understand how they're taking their organizations into the future. Or we've discussed ideas around the future of work with leading academics all over the world. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, my name is Shalini Lal, and I'm a co founder of Uncube, which is an education and advisory firm around the future of work. I work there along with my colleagues Jaspreet Bindra and Papia Banerjee. And now for today's episode. And before we start, let me say that today I have a very, very special guest, Dr. Neha Shah. And what makes this so special is that Neha and I were together for our doctoral studies. So, as we were joking just before we started, this is the first time I have a classmate coming onto this show. And I'm super excited to have the opportunity to discuss her work in the many, many years that have been since we graduated. So, let me just bring on Neha. Hi, Neha.
Hi, many years since we've graduated.
Many, many years since we
The
graduated.
aged ladies that we are.
You look just the same, so it's hard to believe. It's so good
Thanks.
to have you on the show, Neha. So good to have you on the show.
Yes, and
And,
thanks for asking.
you know, all of you must know that Neha is a director at the Microsoft Global Analytics team. But before this, she was an academic and she was a professor at Rutgers University. Now, her interest in organizational network analysis, or perhaps as it used to be called back in the day, social network analysis, goes back to at least 2004 and perhaps even before that. So I know because we used to discuss this, Neha, when we were just starting out the program. Do you want to talk a little bit about what got you interested in organizational network analysis at a time when I think it was only academics who were talking about it?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm enjoying this because even being with you, it reminds me of being way younger and the fun that we used to have at that time. Um, yeah, so I was a strategy consultant a bit after my undergraduate studies, and I remember this particular example, and anybody who's heard me talk about how I got into this has probably heard me tell this story. But I remember we had one of those 100-hour weeks where you're putting together this huge deck, and we presented it to this guy, and he looked at it, and he's like, "Look, Joe told me that's not a good idea. I'm not going to get involved in this," and sort of pushed it back. And our jaws dropped, and we thought, "What? Who is Joe? And why is it that Joe is more important than the data that you have in front of you?" And I realized at that point that what was driving so much of what was going on was just the influence that Joe had over this situation, and really over in the relationship with this person. And so, you know how it is, once you start to see something, you see it everywhere, right? And so I started to see that it was really, and this, now after Facebook and all that, this seems sort of like very naive. But at that time, it was like I started to see that it was this relationships, that it was this influence that was driving so much of what was happening in that organization, what was happening in my other client organizations, and even what was happening in my own organizations, which teams people were put on, whether we were in Canada in the middle of winter, or whether we were in Florida in the middle of winter, right? All of this was driven by these relationships. And as I started to think about it and get deeper and deeper into it, I started to recognize that there was actually a body of research focused on this, and it was called informal social networks. And so I decided I got to learn more about how this works and how it affects the way that everybody does their work. And that led me to leave consulting and join academia, where you and I met at UCLA. And so I've been thinking about and working on networks and organizational networks for over 20 years now, and I've just been fascinated by it. And I suspect that, and hopefully, after some of the folks finish with our call today, that they too will start seeing the world in terms of these networks.
Wonderful. Listen, Neha, For someone who is hearing this topic for the first time, because
Yes.
it wasn't until a few years back that this was even a thing, in organizations. It was obviously a topic of conversation in academia for maybe over 20, 25 years, but it hadn't quite become mainstream. And perhaps
Yeah.
it still isn't completely mainstream, but most organizations are at least considering or thinking about it.
Thinking. Yeah.
How would you explain organizational network analysis in its simplest form?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I think many of the folks that are probably tuned in today are thinking about data analytics in some form. So I'll take it from that data analytics perspective and the way that we often talk about some of the things that we do at Microsoft and how they vary in terms of the general analytics and the general work analytics and the network-based ones. So if you think about anonymous group of individuals, then at the individual level, you can get a sense of how much are people working after hours. That might be an analytic point that you might be able to understand. So what extent does this group of individuals work after hours? At that point, you're focusing on the individual. You can then start to say, what about if we start to consider two people in parallel? So we start to say the relationship. We can start to say, to what extent are managers meeting with their subordinates or with their direct reports? And how much time are they spending with their direct reports? How much time are they spending with others? How diverse is the network of that individual? Now, I use the term network there, but we're really still focused on the one person and their association with another person. So we're just looking at these direct connections. What's really cool is that as we kind of broaden out, and you can almost imagine that we're taking this camera and going farther and farther and farther up, and so you can start to see a broader landscape before you. So we focused on the individual and the relationship with others, and now we can start to say, what about if you start to consider the connections that those people have to others and those people have to others? And suddenly you start to see this system. And you can start to see the system through which information and collaboration is flowing. And then you can start to get a very different perspective and a whole host of different measures on the ways that people are working. That could be that certain groups of people have influence within the network because they are sought out for information more than others are. And so you could see, if you could imagine a pipe with water flowing through it, you could see it going towards that individual. You could see that some individuals might be playing the role of a bridge. And so information flows through them more often than it flows through others. You could imagine that let's kind of zoom all the way out. You could imagine that there are different parts of the organization that might be entirely siloed from the other parts of the organization. You could see that there might be fragments or clusters across the organization. And so in that way, you can start at the very smallest building block of of organizational analytics, but then take it out to this network and start seeing the way that people fit into the pattern and indeed the pattern itself, and how is it that pattern can inform you about what's going on in the organization.
I have to admit that when I used to look at the work you were doing at UCLA, I was so jealous of the beautiful diagrams you would come up with. It was super cool.
It was super cool.
And they used to say so much about what was happening. Do you want to talk about why, or what are some of the factors driving the fact that organizational network analysis is now coming into organizations in a much more real way than perhaps any time in the past when this was an idea and something nice to think about, but nobody quite knew what to do with it?
Yeah, I think a large part of that is computational power, right? And so back when I was in grad school, and even when I was in my days as a professor, when I was doing research, we often did research on social networks in the organization using surveys. And so in that survey form, we would ask people, who are the people that you think are important? Who are the people that you collaborate with in order to get your work done? And of course, that survey and what you may hear as an active form of social network analysis or organizational network analysis. In that active way, we do surveys, but then it's wonderful because we can get your perspective, for example, on your interactions with others. But it also means that we can only survey so many people at a certain time, that you have to deal with missing data. And in networks, as you can imagine, if you're missing parts of the network or pieces of it, you're really not understanding how things are flowing. And in addition, if you're trying to get information repeatedly, it's really hard, like any of us who've ever had to fill out surveys, it's really hard to ask people to repeatedly fill out surveys and assume that they're all going to do it at the time that we need them to do it. And so that sort of constrained how much we could study. And indeed, there are still benefits to doing that. And there are reasons that you might still do that in conjunction with what's happening more now. Now we're seeing a lot more of this kind of passive network collection. And that's probably why you're seeing a lot more of it in organizations. Now we can start to say, let's take, and at Microsoft, what we do, we take the digital exhaust. So we say, let's look at an anonymized way. So we're not affecting anyone's privacy, but we're saying, let's understand how it is that people, their email communication patterns, their meeting communication patterns, their chats communication patterns, what do the patterns look like? And what can we glean from understanding those patterns? Now, suddenly, instead of looking at 100 people at a time, you can look at 100,000 people at a time. And I think that's what's really driving the broader interest that's coming to organizations. I also think that there's been a shift change, and you can probably speak better to this than I can. I think there's been a shift change in the way that organizations look at people, right? And so I think that part of that is just in shifting the way that we view technology as a partner in the way that we work with people in organizations.
So tell me, Neha, what are important parts of what you call the digital exhaust? By the way, that's the first time I'm hearing that, and I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. So, you spoke about emails, chats, meetings. Are there any other parts of it?
So those are what we consider in our and oftentimes what's considered passive network collection. Those are the kinds of things where we don't have to get in and say, Shalini, who are you friends with? Who are the people that you talk to? Who do you collaborate with? Just by understanding, we can understand the way that email is flowing throughout the network. And by that, I'm saying who's emailing whom, we can understand what does that pattern of the network look like? Where are the meetings occurring? Where are the chats occurring? Again, we're not trying to get down to the individual level of analysis. We're really focused here on that anonymized, aggregated level of analysis to really see the patterns in what's happening.
Can you give an example of how this would be helpful to an organization?
Yeah, I can probably talk about this for much longer than you have, I think. There's many, many ways that this could be helpful. So let's talk about the future of work, because I think, given the topic. One way you can think about this, and this is sort of an advanced way of using the network capabilities that might be available to your organization, is you might say, listen, we've been remote for quite some time now. We're going to be managing people remotely, and we may be deciding, should we bring some people back into the office? Who should we bring back into the office? It's a question that many organizations are grappling with. So what we might do is look at the network of the team. Let's say there's a 100-person team. And we might say, let us understand, are there certain teams that are working in this very cohesive way? Or if we look over the past year and a half, are we seeing that the team is actually becoming more and more fragmented as time goes on? And we might say, in those teams that are continuing to work in this very cohesive way, where most people are talking to most people, information seems to be flowing relatively freely, the way things are works well. We don't need to really step in and intervene. However, in some teams, we might see that there are these fragments occurring where we see people kind of separating out into subgroups. Those might be the teams where we need to say there's some sort of intervention needed. If we have the capability of bringing them back in the office, then it may be that those teams that are displaying that sort of fragmentation pattern, those might be the ones that we need to bring back into the office, because they really are in need of some sort of face-to-face communication or some team-oriented one. If they're geographically distributed, for example, and we're seeing more of this separation happening, which is most teams in most organizations. I myself am remote from my team that works mostly in Seattle, and I'm on the East Coast of the United States. Then what you might say is, all right, well, are there other things that we should be doing in order to facilitate more of an interaction? So by using the network, by understanding what the pattern of collaboration is, we can see right away within a month or even less that there's this fragmentation occurring. So maybe what we need to do is we need to take time zones more into account. We need to make sure that everybody understands what are the diverse roles and capabilities that people are bringing to the table. We need to have more often team kind of town hall sort of meetings so that everybody is feeling a sense that they are in this together, that there's a shared goal, whatever it is, and that fits with the particular context in that particular organization and the culture of that particular organization. You might think about things that would work, that would say, we're separating out way more than we think is acceptable for this particular group or this particular type of organization, and the trend is not a positive one. Therefore, we need to intervene, and we need to do it well. The benefit of this is that a lot of times we often don't know about these problems until far too long after they've existed, right? So many of the surveys that we do to find out whether there are problems, like the annual engagement surveys or things like that, those kinds of things happen on literally on an annual basis. And so by the time the problem has occurred, we're quite a bit out. Now we can right off the bat say, oh, it's within the last month. And right now, these sorts of insights are crucial, I think, as we are moving at this faster and faster pace in this, for lack of a better term, weirder and weirder way of working compared to a way that we've ever worked before.
So just so that I make sure I'm understanding this correctly, Neha, what you're saying is that, in the example you're speaking about, you're saying that network analysis can help organizations get a clue that some teams are working in a fragmented way. And by fragmented way, what you mean is that information doesn't flow well across the team, but there are subgroups, and information tends to flow within subgroups more than it does within the entire team. And then that sort of raises a red flag for the organization and says, okay, potential problem ahead. And then it's for the organization to sort of think about what kind of intervention makes sense. And, you spoke of several possibilities, like if they're going to come back into office together, then, bring them in as a whole team. Or if they're working virtually apart, just the way you are with your team, then organize other ways so that they feel connected, etc.
That's right. And one of the ways, for those that are new to it, that I found this helpful is to kind of go back and think about that in terms of plumbing and pipes again, right? And so if you think of these pipes as the connections between people, right? So you and I may be connected, and what's flowing through us is information. I'm sharing information with you every time we collaborate, right? So every time we email or have meetings or have chats, we're exchanging information. And therefore, we're collaborating. We're learning from each other. We may even be generating new knowledge together. And so that's happening in every one of these connections. And so as you broaden out to say the connections between you and me, but then also the connections, the people that you work with and the people that they work with. And as you add that on, you can think about information flowing through the network. And so what network analysis can enable us to do is to say, where is information flowing in ways that all of the people that need to get that access to that information are all getting it? And where is it that it's not flowing when it needs to be flowing? So even if we're looking at a large organization, we might say, hey, this organization seems really, this part of the organization seems really siloed from the other. Should it be? And we may say, in some terms, yeah, we're an innovation hub and we really want them to be off doing their own thing. And so in some respects, we don't really want information flowing as much back and forth because we want them to be thinking independently. In other respects, we might say, hey, this is a really big problem. There's only one person that's connecting this whole group of people to this entire group of people. That could be a really big issue for us. One, because there's not as much information flowing back and forth as there could be. Second, because that connection between that soul connection between this group and this group is really functioning as a critical point of vulnerability for the organization, right? And if something were to happen, that person were to leave the organization or to fall ill, suddenly that entire group of people, all of the information that should be flowing from this group to the large organization wouldn't. And that could create massive issues with productivity for the organization.
Makes sense. Neha, you spoke about, then two things. One, the fact cohesion, team cohesion as your first example. And then, of course, you spoke about thinking of it in terms of information flow.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways in which understanding information flows can be helpful for a business leader?
Yeah, so there's quite a few. Some is and I can give you some examples. Let's start with the very simple. So if we can let's take an example of a relatively large organization. Let's say around 300 people, right? So an organization within an organization. And we'll say in this business unit, we can understand all of the information flows that are occurring here. What we might start to see is we might start to say, hey, things seem, we would start. Actually, let me preface this because I think this is, you and I had talked about this before. You always want to start with what is the business problem. And so for business problems, whether it's a very small organization, so like I said, most of what we've done before was 100 people or less, right? So whether it's for a very small organization or whether it's for a very large one, you would say, all right, what's the business problem at hand? And the business problem may be, hey, things are really slow here. And we can't seem to get things done in the time that we need to. We need to figure out where the inefficiency is and why there is some inefficiency here. And if we do that, we may find that there are some parts that within that organization, I apologize, it's like 6 o'clock in the morning here, so my brain is slow turning on, that within that organization, we may see that information is flowing perhaps only through the manager. So everything that needs to get done seems to go through those managers. So if you can imagine that bridging notion that I mentioned before, we can measure bridging and we could see that there are a certain group or a certain role in which people are playing much more of a bridging role than others in the organization are. Everything needs to flow through these people in order to get things done. And we've seen this in many organizations. This often is a problem. When that happens, that creates a variety of issues. It means that, one, everything's slow, right? Because all of those things need to flow through those people in order to get done. Two, it means that for the employees, there's a lack of trust and a lack of feeling of empowerment, because really I'm relying on somebody to tell me that this is okay to do before I can do it. And that means that I'm a bit frozen in the way that I work. And we know for a sense, the sense of meaning that people derive from their work, that can also have an impact. So in terms of empowerment, it could be slowing down the productivity, but also having a negative impact on the feeling of trust that people are feeling in their work. And again, that's something that can be easily resolved by saying, all right, well, not all of these things need to go through this particular role, like the manager role, in order to get done. Some of these things can be things that we can empower employees to do, but we can't understand that unless we can see how the flows of information are occurring.
Just to make sure, Neha, that I've understood you absolutely correctly, what you're saying is that the shape of the network reveals
the structure, the pattern or the structure.
Pattern or structure of the network reveals, how centralized or decentralized the organization is, how empowered people are feeling.
Yeah, it can help us to understand how empowered people are feeling. Now, I can't do it in this. You're seeing the sunrise behind me here.
Yeah.
It can't help us to understand exactly, Shalini, you feel empowered or not. right? Because we can understand that best by asking you and doing surveys in organizations. But it can help us understand that there's a likelihood that these people aren't feeling as empowered because everything that needs to get done has to go through somebody else.
Right. Very interesting.
Yeah.
So if you're a business leader, and say you've heard of organizational network analysis, maybe someone in your team has attended a talk like ours, and comes back and says there's this really cool tool, we should use it. How do you think an organizational or a business leader should start to even think about what might be potential avenues for using ONA in their organization?
Yeah. Again, I would start kind of with what are the business problems that they're currently facing? Are they facing questions of empowerment, for example? Are they facing questions of some of these process questions that I raised earlier? There's a whole host of different ways. So what I can do is offer you, let me give you a few examples so that it can kind of jog the way that you could use it. One is we often see organizations in which the leaders are trying to create some kind of change. And so we worked with an organization previously where they wanted to create some change, and the CEO said, well, do this. And then why aren't they doing it? we've done this big blitz and everybody should be doing it. Now, enter organizational network analysis. So what we could do is by understanding the flows of communication patterns, we can understand particular roles in organizations that might be playing influential roles, meaning that they might be sought out by others who are sought out. So with that, we can say, these managers who have all been with the organization for 10 years, who have XYZ characteristics, these are the people that are really influential inside the organization. And so what we need to do is and by influence, I mean, these are the people that are sought out for information by others who are sought out for information. So people really care what they have to say. So if we understand that, we can say, rather than trying to implement change by blitzing the entire organization, we can use our resources much more wisely and say, let's first get buy-in from these people, from these folks who can function as influencers. Let's make sure we have their considerations and their issues or comments taken into account, and let's make sure we can get them on board. If we can make them our advocates by taking into account their perspective, then we can say, hey, right off the bat, we can make sure that we are gearing up to have a rollout that's going to be much more positive and grounds up. So that's one kind of large example. And I saw that there's some comments here about large organizations versus small ones. So let me take an example where a small organization could think about the network. Now, if you have 3 people in your organization, it's obviously not going to be quite as useful, and I'll be fair. But I think if you have 50-ish plus people, I think you're in a really good position to use this. And you can start thinking about it from employees day one. Even when we're thinking about onboarding employees, some of the reasons that we know that onboarding really matters to the way that organizations do their work, whether employees are high performers, whether they're engaged, whether they stay with the company, is the kinds of relationships that they form with others in the organization. Do they even become well integrated? And so we can start to say, how connected are they? Are they forming connections with others in the organization? And to what extent are they doing so? How embedded are they becoming? So in the examples that I've given you, we've started even with day one from onboarding and these small kinds of how connected are you? Are you becoming a person who has influence in the network? You could think about this from diversity and inclusion, which is a big interest in the United States right now and in various parts of the world. So are we being inclusive? Do people feel like they're a big part of the organization? To broader questions of change, to broader questions of silos in organizations.
That's a lot of really interesting examples. So, I was just making notes. You've spoken about the extent of team cohesion versus fragmentation.
That's right.
The extent to which information flows are centralized with a few people versus more decentralized. The extent to which there are critical vulnerabilities with 1 or 2 individuals sort of being the key bridges between different groups. D&I, change, onboarding.
Yeah.
So those are really at the heart of the entire question about how our organizations engagement, information flows are all structured, and how we are moving as an organization in whatever direction the
That's right.
business leadership is looking at. So I'm going to take a look at some of the comments and questions. Dr. Vijay Kumar says, awesome. So from awesome. Anu, hi, great to be part of this discussion. Hi, Anu. Vas says, two questions. How is this network analysis implemented in an organization? How does one even begin? Like, what's the first step?
Microsoft. Let me do my own plug. So you can do it two ways, to be fair. One is if you're depending on the kinds of questions that you're interested in the organization. If you're really interested in who do I seek for advice, for example, then you might do a survey, because that's the best way to get at it, and that active type of network analysis. In the passive type of network analysis, you might work with Microsoft and the Workplace Analytics Group, or we're actually M365 Insights, as we're known as right now. And you might work with us to understand how is it that these patterns look in the organization, again, using this very anonymized way of working. So on that note, I see Papia has a question around privacy. So let's talk about that for a moment. When you start talking about networks, that ends up being one of the first questions that I tend to have with customers, large or small. And it's a very good one. I think it's in line with pretty much any questions of network analytics. For us, privacy is foremost. So everything that we do is in an anonymized and aggregated form. For example, even when we're talking about providing information of do people work a great deal after hours? That information is only at least in groups of 5 and so on, right? So we try not to get at the individual level of analysis. Then the question becomes, well, but you're talking about networks, and you're talking about people's positions in our networks. If you take the example of influence that you described, how can I identify those influencers if I want to enact change, if I don't consider privacy? And the way that we recommend you do so, because we believe that it's so important to retain the privacy of your employees, for not only the guidelines that Microsoft kind of adheres to and kind of holds itself up to, but also for your own governmental laws and for your company, for the trust that your employees place in you as a company, is, let's take this example of influence. Rather than say it's Shalini who's the influential person, you're better off saying, what are the attributes of those that are influential? And so you could say people who have been managers in their role for 5 years, they've been with the company for at least 10 years, they're all based in the Noida office, they are, whatever other attributes that you might be able to address, you can create sort of this cohort. And rather than identify individuals at that level, you can identify cohorts. The question then will be, but then you might get some people that aren't influencers. So to that, I would say, yes, but that risk is much better than the risk of violating privacy, right? And so we do have documents that our privacy team prepares to help companies think through this, think through what are the threats that you should consider, what are kind of the worst case scenarios that you should consider if you do decide to go down any route where you really feel like you need to identify individuals. Again, I would say, to the extent that you can identify ways of not doing so, that's a much better way to use this tool.
No, because Neha, when I'd announced our conversation and I had sort of put up the notice of our talk in a couple of groups I'm part of, actually people's first reaction was just around that. that, how do we manage, what's the ethics around privacy? And, I like what you're saying in that there is valuable information, but it's really important that that valuable information is collected in a manner that doesn't leave people feeling vulnerable or exposed. And therefore, it's a better idea to sort of be able to identify the characteristics or even groups. Anything at a higher level, enough information to take action, but not so much information that it has the potential of hurting an individual's, anonymity.
That's right. That's right. Right. And so, when, for example, when we're working with companies, everything that we do is sort of pseudonymized. So it'll be 372524, right? And person 372524, and you're not really identifying that person, right? You're really, so that you can really focus on what are the attributes, what are all of these broader ways that you can maintain the anonymity for the individual and the safety and the privacy, but still have a good understanding of the way that things work in the organization. This is an issue for network analytics. It's a problem for workplace analytics in general. And it's one that every company struggles with in understanding. My gut is always veer away from identifying the individual to the extent possible, because and if you have to, for whatever reason, if you have to, even if you're using the survey method that I described above, be really aware of what the implications are, what the threats are, how your employees might perceive it.
Neha, if you remember the, how organizational engagement surveys or satisfaction surveys back in the day, sort of progressed. They sort of became accepted in a very large way only when there were enough people who were comfortable with the, the sort of sense of anonymity or, lack of identification, at least of a particular individual.
Yeah.
And, I remember that they became mainstream with organizations trusting certain partners and employees feeling comfortable answering a survey only when they knew that they would not be singled out and they could say what they had. So it is similar, and I'm wondering if you think that as organizational network analytics becomes more and more mainstream, there will be best practices and norms that will, not just with Microsoft, but say across the field itself, that will emerge, which will seek to sort of protect individuals' privacy so that some of these concerns.
Yeah, I think that parallel is really spot on. And so yes, is the answer to that. Yeah. And I think in the very same way, right? Just when we do our surveys, oftentimes we're saying, man, the organization is not doing what I really want it to be doing right now. And we're taking a risk every time we answer that survey in that way. So, when we're doing this kind of data collection, and any data collection, I think we need to retain that level of privacy for our employees. I think it's just it's really paramount to the trust that they have in us.
Right. I'm just going to take a few more questions. Hi, Papia. So good to see you here. And great question. Bindi says, how do external networks individuals have play a role in organizational networks? Do they?
In the way that we would measure them, no. Of course, they play a role in the information that others seek outside of the organization, but certainly we're not able to have a sense of that entire communication structure, and so we wouldn't be able to bring that into the fold in terms of the analytics that we're doing.
Right. Deepak's question you already answered. How can you also tell us how to implement in a small-sized organization?
Onboarding. That's a great way to start.
Sonal, how does ONA in some way disturb the organizational structure and the authority vested in each of the positions? That's a pretty interesting question.
It's a really interesting question. So what I would say is, and this is sort of going, you and I have had, I think, this discussion years and years and years ago. It's because that I think at the heart of this question is that there's these two different types of structures in organizations. There's this official structure, which we all see, and then there's the unofficial structure, which we all know exists in the organization, right? So despite the fact that ABC is my boss, I'm really going to Shalini to ask how do I do this, or to collaborate with more frequently. And so what the network analysis allows us to understand is what is that informal organization that's occurring in networks, or in organizations rather. What's the informal network? What is the way that work is really getting done? And so I don't know that ONA disturbs the organizational structure. I think what it allows us to do is to shine a light on the actual organizational structure, and allows us to say to the authorities, I'm not, that word seems kind of funky, but to those who have that formal power, we can say, you know, what does that formal power and that formal structure look like with the way that information is actually flowing through the organization? Mm-hmm. Potentially there's some ignorance is bliss, I suppose. But I think the reality is that if you can understand it, you can do so much more. And in terms of engagement, in terms of productivity, in terms of efficiency, in terms of so many of the things that I've talked about today, whether your company is trying to be an agile one, which is what many companies are trying to do, whether your company is trying to ensure that their employees are engaged and they have a positive employee experience, whether they feel included, and so on. So ignoring it may feel like bliss if you're in an official position of authority, but in reality, all these things are happening anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's better to understand them and to work with them in order to meet organizational goals is where I come from.
No, thanks. It makes a lot of sense, because it's like the organization on the paper is different from the organization in reality, always.
Right, always.
Chirag, and I realize we're coming to the end of our time, so we'll just take one more question, and
let's take that flat organization question.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So somebody's asking the future.
Let me read it out. So,
yeah. Oh yeah, please.
Futurist flat organizations and span of control will be more horizontal. What do you think?
Yes. So again, you and I have had these conversations before too, which is so funny after all these years. Flat organizations come with it their own problems, right? What that shows us is in the official hierarchy that there isn't this sort of status contest going on. But in reality, as humans, we have this need to kind of form these status hierarchies, right? And so unofficially, there will be this angling for power. I strongly believe, and I believe that there's some research out there that suggests that when you're trying to move towards these flat organizations, things actually become much more political. In organizations with hierarchy, people kind of know where they stand. When there isn't that hierarchy there, people are kind of duking it out to get all the resources, to get that power, to get that status. And so things become like academia, right? And so things become much more political in the way that things work. So if the future is indeed flat organizations, then informal networks are going to be even more important, because they are really going to explain what's actually going on in terms of how things are flowing. Because the official hierarchy chart is going to tell you very little and nothing, really, if it's a really flat organization, whereas the network is actually going to give you a lot of information about how are people collaborating, how are people, where is information flowing, and how can we create changes that will enable a more positive work environment and a more productive organization.
Wow. Neha, I just loved our conversation today. It was such a reminder of, all the different applications for organizational network analysis, some of which I'd actually quite forgotten. And you've given us such a long list. But before we end today, any last words for people who are listening in, and, how can they begin to become familiar with the art and science of organizational network analysis?
So we'll post a couple afterward. We'll post a couple of articles. I've been a professor for a long time, and I think there are on the I saw on the invite list there were a few of my former students, so they probably have some sort of fear of doing homework. So we'll rather than giving previous work, we'll post some articles that you could read. Some which have come out also from our own work at Microsoft, even over the last portion of time with COVID involved, and so they're fascinating. Others can just start. I would say the very smallest thing you can do is start thinking about the way that people are working. Think about these informal ways of working. Think about the types of relationships that may be really driving the way that things are getting done, and then think about how you might use the digital technologies that are available to you to start to examine networks and start to think about networks and analytics. So I will do a shameless plug for Microsoft because I have you here and because we are old friends. We have a really neat event occurring today at 9:00 Eastern, focused on the employee experience. And Shalini, I sent you the link, and so you can post it, and so you can join in and see one of the ways that you might be able to do that by working with us as well.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Neha. Thank you so much for your time. It was
yes.
so wonderful to have you on the show to speak about, a topic that I think is just beginning to come into conversation. And I think the understanding around organizational network analysis is it's still early days.
Yes, yes. I mean, we're seeing that it is just expanding with our own customer base, with conversations that we're having, certainly with the folks that are joining us here, and the ways that you can use it and think about it, and the benefit of networks and understanding the way that information flows and people fit into the organization and the structure of the organization. And clearly, I'm fascinated. I've been fascinated for 20 years. I've been trying to get you to be fascinated. I think I converted you a long time ago. And hopefully this worked for everybody else on the
No, you did. I still remember your super funky charts. Really cool. Thank you so much. Thank you, Neha. I know that you have a busy day ahead. It's an early morning for you. Thank you so much for making the time. I know you joined at 6 a.m. for you. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to see you. Lovely conversation with you, to be reminded of our younger days.
Such a pleasure. Such a pleasure. So for everyone else watching, I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. One of the things that's so fascinating is how just the study of data exhaust, as Neha spoke about, again, that's a new term for me, can reveal so much about what's actually happening in the organization that tends to sort of be under the radar most of the time. And if one can make use of some of that data in a way that does not threaten the privacy or anonymity of individuals, one can still use that data to do a lot of useful things with it. And she spoke, of course, of a very wide range of applications, right from onboarding to management of change, to management of team cohesion, engagement, centralization, decentralization, empowerment, and so on. I'm sure I've missed quite a few as well. So that's really a whole host of questions that all of us as business and HR leaders are interested in understanding more and more about our organization. So if you liked our conversation, please feel free to share it on your wall so that all your colleagues and friends can also watch this and join in. Our next conversation is actually going to be this Saturday at noon, and we have the CHRO of Reckitt Benckiser India, Smriti Handa, coming on to speak about the management of culture while working virtually. So do join us then. For all our past episodes, and we have 26 of them, visit the Uncube website, and we cover a very wide range of topics. So pick any that you're interested in. Many of them are about technology. Some of them are about business strategy, some about innovation, design thinking, and there are many around leadership and human resources. So pick a topic that's of interest. And with that, have a great rest of the evening. Bye for now.
Take care.